Bombshell tonight in the investigation of the death of a young man, Nolan Wells. Death threats are flying. One actually says there's going to be blood, so much blood. Another death threat says, don't go outside. How can anybody do their jobs when they're getting death threats?
A man in southwest suburban Berwyn was arrested for making death threats against people who were involved in this unresolved case. Now our investigative reporter Chuck Gowdy in studio revealing that Berwyn man's violent history and has the first photos of this accused threat maker. Chuck.
You do, Allison, Stephan. The Berwyn man's name is Edward James Porter, now facing federal charges in the Nolan Wells case for allegedly threatening to murder witnesses and their family members. 33-year-old Porter is being transferred by U.S. Marshals to the courthouse down in Mississippi. Our investigation of Porter's past finds a Metro Chicago man repeatedly described by authorities as a threat to safety because of his numerous arrests for violence and saying he was going to shoot people.
Village pump stopped working. We're sinking.
The heat index was a broiling 105 during last month's July 4th holiday weekend here on Horn Island, Mississippi. 18-year-old Nolan Wells had taken a short boat ride with friends, but didn't return home with them. His body found 2 days later, face down in the water. With no resolution to what happened, his family and national civil rights leaders have raised questions of a racially motivated killing. And then, as NBC Chicago's investigative team reported last week, a man living in this west suburban Berwyn apartment was arrested for allegedly making death threats to witnesses in the case to kill them, anyone in their homes, and any cops. Porter is also accused by federal prosecutors of threatening to cut up one witness and stuff the remains into a suitcase. Now, NBC5 Investigates uncovers the first photo of Edward Porter. This picture is from the Cook County Jail in 2025, but records we've obtained show Porter's criminal history began years earlier, in 2011, to follow for domestic violence, breaking court orders of protection, and theft. A city and suburban drifter with no known ties to Nolan Wells or Mississippi. Porter had an Illinois firearm owner card and a handgun that were taken from him when police say he threatened his ex-girlfriend, quote, "I'm going to shoot you." Charges later dropped when she stood down, and it's not known whether the FOID card and gun were returned to Porter. But now, after numerous gun violence, assault, and threat charges by Chicago authorities, most later dropped because the victim wouldn't testify, Porter is facing his first federal charges, accused of inserting himself for unstated reasons into this death mystery in Mississippi. The case against him, according to U.S. investigators, has a trail of cell phone calls from Porter to Mississippi witnesses and IP addresses, all linking back to him and this Berwyn apartment where he was living. When Porter was arrested 11 days ago, Berwyn police accompanied federal agents with the Chicago FBI field office apprehension team. According to Berwyn police records that NBC5 Investigates obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, Porter did not put up a fight. He's due at a Gulfport, Mississippi courtroom on September 3rd. That'll be the first time he's seen down there.
So strange that he even...
Here's some of the people that's ridiculously lying about the whole thing. Wrote a clip.
Did you catch this in Random Tatum's interview?
About anything else that was mentioned, thousands of lies, and now, the audio comes back, and all of a sudden we can hear Nolan yelling in the background, screaming, we're screaming about how he's dead. That's just a complete lie, and it's another lie.
Release the audio of the staged video then. Release it. That's a big slip up. It's a big mistake to say those words when you were actually there.
We have the video. We played the video. The reason we don't play audio is because some people are saying things and they're not involved. And some of the things that they're saying is maybe embarrassing to them and they're not involved in this. But Nolan is not on any of these boats that's in the video.
Just got arrested. Federal charges, death threats against witnesses in the Nolan Wells case. But here's what doesn't add up. He has no connection to Nolan Wells. He's not from Mississippi. He's not part of the friend group. He's not involved in the case at all. He's a complete stranger. A Chicago man with a violent history, and he's now facing federal prosecution for threatening people he's never met over a case he has no stake in. So why would a stranger from Chicago insert himself into a case 1,000 miles away and threaten to murder people? What would motivate that? What would drive someone to call Mississippi witnesses and threaten their families? And why is he the one being prosecuted when the actual people involved in what happened to Nolan are still walking free, talking to podcasters, and raising money through GoFundMes and defamation lawsuits? This arrest exposes everything. To 9-2. In Fennerns, his name is Edward James Porter, 33 years old, living in a West suburban Berwyn apartment. Federal prosecutors say he placed phone calls to Mississippi witnesses, multiple calls over time, threatening to kill them. Threatening to kill their families. Threatening to cut one witness up and stuff the remains into a suitcase. Federal charges, not local charges. Federal, which means the FBI got involved. U.S. Marshals got involved. This crossed state lines. This became a national security matter. And that's where it gets strange. Edward James Porter has zero connection to Nolan Wells, zero connection to Mississippi, zero connection to the friends involved, no personal stake in the case whatsoever, just a stranger from Chicago who saw the case online and decided to make death threats about it. According to us investigators, Porter made phone calls from his Berwyn apartment directly to Mississippi witnesses. Cell phone records show the calls' IP addresses trace back to his apartment, phone numbers connect to his phone. The evidence trail is clear and direct. And when federal agents showed up to arrest him 11 days ago with Berwyn police and the Chicago FBI field office, he didn't resist. He didn't fight. He cooperated like he knew he was caught, like he expected it, like he accepted that calling and threatening people over the Nolan Wells case would land him in federal custody. And it did. The federal charges against Edward James Porter are serious. These aren't local misdemeanors. These are federal offenses, threatening witnesses across state lines, using telecommunications to make death threats, threatening family members of witnesses, threatening law enforcement. Each of these is a separate federal count. Each of these can mean years in prison. So less specificity of the threats is what makes them federal cases. Not just angry rants, but actual threats of violence. And murder threats. Specific scenarios: cut up remains in suitcases, death threats against family members including children, threats to kill cops if they show up. These are organized threatening patterns. This is conspiracy to intimidate witnesses. This is federal territory. And the evidence is clear. Us investigators have phone records, they have IP addresses, they have cell tower data pinpointing his location when the calls were made, they have documentation of which Mississippi witnesses were targeted, they have records of what he said. This is prosecutable, this is convictable. Edward James Porter is going to prison. Now let's talk about his criminal history because this is where the real story emerges. Edward James Porter's arrest record spans 15 years. From 2011 to 2026. That's 15 years of consistent lawbreaking, consistent interaction with law enforcement, consistent failure to follow rules or respect court orders. In 2011, he got arrested. Then 2012, then 2013, then 2014, one arrest after another, year after year. Domestic violence charges, breaking court orders of protection, theft, assault, threat charges, weapon charges. Over 24 arrests documented. 24 times police had to deal with Edward James Porter. 24 times he violated laws. 24 times he showed he's a danger to society. In one incident in 2020, he threatened his ex-girlfriend, quote, "I'm going to shoot you." He said that to her face, knowing he had an Illinois firearm owner card, knowing he had a handgun, knowing he could actually carry out that threat. The police confiscated the gun, took his firearm owner card. Charges were filed, but then the girlfriend refused to testify. Victims often don't want to go through the trauma of a trial. They refuse to cooperate. So charges got dropped, and it's still unclear if his firearm owner card was ever returned to him, if that gun was ever returned. So from 2011 to 2026, that's 15 years of police records. 15 years of being flagged as a threat to public safety. 15 years of behavior that lands him in jail regularly. 15 years of not maintaining steady employment, not contributing to society, not following court orders, not respecting the law. Just arrest after arrest after arrest. And then in 2026, he calls Mississippi and threatens to murder witnesses in a high-profile case involving a black teenager, in a case that already has massive racial tensions, in a case that's under federal scrutiny, in a case where civil rights leaders are watching. And this man with a violent criminal history decides to get involved through threats. Why? That's the question nobody's answering. Why would Edward James Porter threaten to kill people he doesn't know over a case he has no connection to? What was his motivation? What did he believe happened to Nolan Wells? Was he part of some online community convinced the friends killed Nolan? Did he see the case and feel so angry that he felt compelled to act? Or was something else driving him? The federal prosecutors described the threats as murder threats, death threats, threats against multiple witnesses, threats against family members, threats to cut up remains and put them in a suitcase, specific violent threats, detailed threats, the kind of threats that show planning and intent, not just angry words but actual plans to harm people. And he made these threats from his apartment, from an apartment in Chicago, using his own phone, from his own IP address, like he wasn't even trying to hide, like he didn't care if he got caught, or like he was so convinced in what he believed that he didn't think it was wrong. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Porter is one of 4 or 5 people arrested for threatening the friends in the Nolan Wells case. 4 or 5 arrests for death threats against the witnesses and the defendants. 4 or 5 people decided to threaten them, and all 4 or 5 got arrested. But look at the other side. Nolan's mother, Christine Wells, says she's received threats. She said publicly that people have threatened her. People have threatened her family. People have threatened to harm her for pursuing justice for her son. But how many arrests have been made for threatening Christine Wells? How many federal charges for threats against Nolan's family? The answer is 0. Not one person arrested for threatening the victim's family. That disparity is what should concern you. That imbalance is suspicious. Law enforcement has resources to arrest 4 or 5 people for threatening the friends, but 0 resources for protecting or pursuing threats against the family of the victim. That tells you where law enforcement's priorities are. Not with Nolan, not with Christine, with the friends. Edward James Porter was arrested 11 days ago. He was transferred by U.S. Marshals to Mississippi. He's being held in federal custody. He's due in Gulfport, Mississippi courtroom on September 3rd for his first appearance. U.S. Marshals personally escorting him, federal agents transporting him. This is high priority for law enforcement. But think about this. When Nolan Wells died on July 4th, where was this energy? Where were the U.S. Marshals investigating? Where was the federal task force looking into how an 18-year-old ended up dead after a boat ride with 8 white people? Where was the FBI field office mobilizing resources to find out what happened? The answer is nowhere. No federal response, no urgent investigation, just local police ruling it an accidental drowning and moving on. It took death threats to get federal involvement. It took threats of violence against witnesses to activate the FBI, not the death of a black teenager, not the questions about what happened to Nolan, but threats against the friends. That's what triggered federal response. So Edward James Porter is facing federal charges for threatening witnesses. But the witnesses aren't being charged with anything. The 8 people on that boat aren't being charged. Warren isn't being charged. Bart isn't being charged. Katie isn't being charged. Nobody involved in what actually happened to Nolan is facing federal charges. Just a stranger from Chicago who made threats. And here's the thing. Porter has no motive to kill Nolan Wells. 0 motive. He's from Chicago. He never met Nolan. He doesn't know the friends. He doesn't know the family. There's no personal connection. There's no financial gain. There's no reason for him to be involved in Nolan's death. The only thing he did was threaten people about it after the fact. But the friends, the 8 people on that boat, they had immediate motive. They had opportunity. They had means. They were there. They know what happened. And all 8 of them lawyered up before Nolan's body was even found. That's suspicious. Innocent people don't immediately hire defense attorneys. People who know something did. So Edward James Porter is facing federal charges for threatening witnesses, but the witnesses aren't being charged with anything. The witnesses aren't facing investigation. The 8 people on that boat aren't being charged. Warren isn't being charged. Bart isn't being charged. Katie isn't being charged. None of them. Nobody involved in what actually happened to Nolan on July 4th is facing federal charges. Just a stranger from Chicago who made threats about it. I think about that disparity. Think about what law enforcement is prioritizing. Edward James Porter threatens witnesses, and immediately the FBI gets involved. U.S. Marshals get involved. Federal charges get filed. Prosecutors mobilize. A courtroom in Mississippi gets prepared. All of that resources for a man who has zero connection to Nolan Wells. But Nolan Wells actually died. Nolan Wells' body was found in the Gulf of Mexico. Nolan Wells never came home. And where was the federal response then? Where were the U.S. Marshals investigating how an 18-year-old black kid ended up dead after a boat ride with 8 white people? Where was the FBI field office working 24/7 to figure out what happened? Where was the federal task force interviewing witnesses and analyzing evidence and building a case? The answer is, they weren't there. Not until death threats started. Not until violence against witnesses became imminent. Not until Edward James Porter called Mississippi and threatened to murder people. That's when the FBI showed up. That's when federal resources mobilized. That's when U.S. Marshals got involved. So the message from law enforcement is clear. If you threaten witnesses in the Nolan Wells case, we will pursue you relentlessly. We will deploy federal resources. We will transfer you across state lines. We will prosecute you. But if you're actually involved in what happened to Nolan, if you're one of the 8 on that boat, if you know what really happened, you're protected. You're free. You can do podcast interviews and raise money through GoFundMe and sue people who accuse you. This is a 2-tier justice system. This is prosecution of outsiders while protecting insiders. This is federal response to threats, but no federal response to actual deaths. So here's the question that needs answering. If Edward James Porter is dangerous enough for federal charges, U.S. Marshals, and Mississippi courtroom appearance, why aren't the 8 people on that boat receiving the same level of scrutiny? Why aren't they being investigated with federal intensity? Why is Warren not facing charges for making the Seto call? Why is Bart not being transferred by U.S. Marshals? Why is Katie not being questioned about timeline inconsistencies? Why is nobody from the boat under federal investigation? The answer is because this isn't about justice for Nolan Wells. This is about protecting certain people. This is about silencing voices like Edward James Porter who speak up. This is about prosecuting the outsiders while protecting the insiders. This is about maintaining a narrative that Nolan drowned accidentally while suppressing a narrative that something else happened. And that system failure is what you should be angry about. That prioritization is what should concern you. That disparity is what proves the investigation is broken. Edward James Porter has been arrested 24 times in 15 years. Let that sink in. 24 arrests in 15 years. Roughly 1 arrest every 6 months on average. Consistent lawbreaker. Chronic threat to society. 15 years of behavior that shows he cannot follow rules or respect boundaries. And that's the person sitting in a federal courtroom. That's who the system decided needed federal prosecution. But the friends, the 8 people who were actually on that boat with Nolan, the 8 people who are the last ones to see him alive, the 8 people who know exactly what happened, they have clean records, they hired attorneys, they're protected, they're untouchable. So the system is saying Porter is more dangerous than the 8 people on that boat. Porter is more of a threat than whoever put Nolan in the water. Porter deserves federal investigation and prosecution more than the people actually involved in Nolan's death deserve investigation. That's the message. That's what this arrest communicates. And it should make you angry. It should make you question everything about this case. It should make you wonder what federal law enforcement actually cares about. Because if they cared about Nolan Wells, if they cared about what really happened to an 18-year-old black kid in Mississippi, they would have mobilized federal resources in July when he disappeared. They would have deployed U.S. Marshals to interview the 8 people on that boat. They would have had FBI agents investigating immediately. They would have treated Nolan's death as seriously as they're treating Edward James Porter's threats. But they didn't. They waited until the threats started. They waited until violence against witnesses became imminent. And then suddenly the federal government cares. Suddenly U.S. Marshals show up. Suddenly the FBI is involved. Suddenly there's a priority. This is the arrest that exposes the system. This is Edward James Porter accidentally proving that law enforcement doesn't care about Nolan Wells' death. They care about protecting the witnesses. They care about silencing the voices demanding justice. They care about maintaining the official narrative that nothing suspicious happened. And that's what Edward James Porter's arrest really means. It means the system has priorities, and Nolan Wells isn't one of them. Subscribe so you understand what's really happening in this case.